So Joseph Altshuler is an assistant professor here at the Illinois School of Architecture and co-founder of the design firm Could Be Design. His co-author is Julia Sedlock, the co-founder of Cosmo Design Factory and a community advocate in the village of Philmont, New York, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit today. Without further ado, I will hand the microphone over to them. Please join me in welcoming Julia and Joseph.
Thank you so much, Trudy. Before we begin, we actually have a few other thank yous that we want to extend to a broader community and ecosystem that we're part of. So first, starting with the Siebel Center for Design, and in particular, Rachel Switsky, Nicholas Puttycombe, and also Emily Baer. We appreciate all of your support, your enthusiasm, being interested in this crazy idea of architecture as creatures. We so appreciate you suspending any disbelief and jumping along for this ride together, and we're excited to continue thinking about this together with you. Thank you to the Illini Union Bookstore for selling our books tonight. Thank you so much to our design and fabrication team for the Animate Arcade. This team includes our partner Zach Morrison, our fabrication partner Erica Gressman, School of Architecture faculty Andres Limas-Spont, and also School of Architecture students Ifran Arojo, Amir Zarai, Shravan Arun. Also special thanks to Krishna Jayachandran, Atusa Esmali, and Alejandro Tora Acosto for assisting with photographs. Also, thank you more broadly to my colleagues in the School of Architecture, many of whom are here tonight, and also more broadly in the College of Fine and Applied Arts. The indigenous creation myth of Turtle Island describes an assortment of species working together to build a continental landmass on the back of a turtle in order to create a place for Sky Woman to touch down as she falls from Sky World. We wish to invoke this collective act of world building as one aspect of our acknowledgement that we sit on the forcefully stolen lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. This is a starting place from which to invent new stories for new worlds that we'll build together as we collectively and individually decolonize and unsettle ourselves.
So moving on or building from that, I'll start by saying that this book is an experiment in world building, but not one where we actually create a new world that we, Joseph and I as authors, want to see or have a very clearly defined vision of, but rather where we plant seeds for a world that we would like to build together by suggesting ways of seeing and being in the world that kind of reshuffle what we collectively prioritize and value. The seeds that we planted in this book consist of a set of notions of fancies or queries that implicitly are framed as kind of what ifs, like what if buildings looked like creatures or behaved like creatures? What would that do to our relationships with those buildings? Is it possible for us to be friends with a building? Can we be intimate with a building, or can a building be intimate with us? So in that spirit of kind of intimacy and relationship building, we've prepared a personal ad for that this book might write if it was kind of looking for partnership or a desired audience of readers to participate in this world building journey. Are you in search of an open-minded and imaginative companionship with humans, non-humans, and abiotic entities? Then we might be a good match. I enjoy cloud watching, tickling Doric columns to make them laugh. Why so serious? And cohabitating with an assortment of animate beings. I tell stories from various perspectives, including buildings, provide bite-sized, digestible quantities of historical background, reject anthropocentric conventions of architectural canon, reference popular culture, news headlines, and memes whenever possible, and catalog a selected archive of contemporary architecture, both speculative and built, that provide clues about how architecture might become more companionable and intimate. I appreciate cooperation, flexibility, and a willingness to get sidetracked a few times along the way. Will you join me for an adventure?
All right. So while these things are very overlapping, just for clarity, we're gonna take you on a sort of lightning speed trip through some of the kind of key themes and ideas of the book, which in turn inform sort of the motivation and the sort of broader ambition behind the installation that we're sitting in. So there's a series of concentricities here, but we're gonna be talking about the book as a starting point to think about this space we find ourselves in, and thinking about it as a kind of test bed or a kind of prototype for a way of relating to the built environment in a broader way. So this is the table of contents of our book. So we'll just start with the sort of structure of our book. The book weaves a kind of loose narrative arc that connects both different voices and also different perspectives. And actually each part of the book opens with a fictional interlude that's written from the perspective of a dwelling of the past, a dwelling of the future, a dwelling of the present that we found ourselves in when we wrote the book. And to be clear, the premise of the book is a provocation. It's a true experiment. We really don't know the answers yet. And in that sense, and along with our kind of personal ad for the book, we're asking you to kind of leap into this with us as we try to figure this out. So our book kind of roughly follows a trajectory where we start with a discussion of architectural creatures. This is an illustration from one of these memoirs that's written from the perspective, in this case, of a dwelling of the past. But it moves, and by architectural creatures, we are literally thinking about structures, buildings, dwellings that start to resemble biotic beings. But as the book progresses, we really kind of shift our attention away from the kind of maybe perhaps literalism of an architectural creature, and we really start thinking more about creaturely architecture. So architecture that may not look like an animal or a biotic being, but an architecture that starts to behave like one, that maybe starts to interact like one, and that starts to kind of invoke a kind of series of relationships and intimacies between ourselves and other humans, between buildings and other buildings and landscapes, and also between humans and buildings.
So I think we're gonna just structure the rest of our talk right now around simply the title of the book and unpacking it, because the title alone has sort of a lot embedded in it. Creatures Are Stirring, A Guide to Architectural Companionship. What do we mean by all of this? What do we mean when we use the term creatures? Why are we using creatures to describe architecture if architecture is inanimate, right? Or we make that assumption. So, we cast a very wide net when we talk about creatures, and we do that intentionally. But if you just if you just do a very quick, internet search of the definition of creatures, it's sort of validated that wide net. It starts an animal as distinct from a human being, so that's one option. An animal or a person, so then we're including ourselves, humans. A fictional or imaginary being, typically a frightening one. So already there's, a creature can be human or non-human, real or imaginary, but then if you keep going, the etymology of the word reveals its Latin root meaning to create, or the medieval meaning, anything created, hence a thing, in general, animate or not, a thing created, the creation, a creature. So, just looking at that history already, there's justification for throwing architecture into this cauldron of creatures. It is a created thing. And we can include anything that's animate and abiotic that's stirred into that pot. So in the first essay of the book, we're looking at architectural creatures through the lens of zoomorphism, which is formal and behavioral characteristics that highlight animate qualities of architecture, a formal resemblance to animals in a more literal sense, like Joseph mentioned before. And these, sorry, I need to just turn the page. But I think the point that we want to make is that we're not necessarily interested in literal or explicit representations of animal form as an end in themselves, but rather to kind of highlight the fluidity and sometimes arbitrary nature of the lines that we draw around the relationship between form and meaning. And so really looking at not necessarily zoomorphism because we want things to look like animals, but really this notion of morphisms, that the lines between humans and animals and objects and buildings and landscapes have this sort of spectrum of legibility and decidability and definiteness, that there are these moments where things can start to look a little bit like a tiger or a leopard and also maybe a bear in a different position. So are we at the matrix? Yeah, so one of the things that we do in the book is catalog through these matrices a series of contemporary projects to create a kind of more clear definition about how these kinds of morphisms fall into different categories. We're not going to get into that right now. But really the end game with all of this is to say that throughout the kind of conventional canon of architectural history, anthropocentric anthropomorphism, so the references to the human body, tend to dominate, and that we believe that looking at this, at zoomorphism or morphisms more broadly, that we can start to move ourselves away from this anthropocentric perspective.
And I think just to sort of finish that thought, like we're both tickled and inspired by examples like this. This was a kind of situation that occurred in May of 2020 when there was a superstorm and the power went out at what used to be called the Sears Tower, now the Willis Tower. Still the Sears Tower to me. And the power went out, leaving this kind of strange semblance of a face in the upper stories, which was created by the emergency lights of the Sears Tower. And this was May 2020, and so Twitter started went crazy with even the Sears Tower is feeling kind of disgruntled and down about the state of the world. And I think while this is not an example by any means of something that literally looks like an animal or a species that we may recognize, there suddenly was this collective consciousness across the city that actually the Sears Tower has feelings too. And in fact, that the Sears Tower has a kind of something that we can empathize with as kind of humans that are cohabitating along with it. So this is kind of like where we're headed with this idea of zoomorphism, and morph in a much kind of broader sense. So creatures are stirring. To kind of break down the next piece of the title. What do we mean by stirring? Stirring can mean many things, including to mix, to move, also to arouse emotion. We were really excited and moved by an explanation, or a kind of reading of stirring that was offered by a friend, a fellow traveler of ours, Dr. Regner Ramos. He writes that stirring has disruptive connotations. To stir is to mess up the purity of a thing, to blend, to merge different things, whether they're ingredients in a stew or unconventional ideas on architectural discourse. Stirring also implies the recognitions of our habits, movements, and particularities, a daily series of actions and reactions in acts of love and understanding. And ultimately, to show that perhaps our world isn't as precious and cloistered as it might look like, and that more importantly, we can and share worlds. This inspires us deeply, and for us, stirring also kind of takes us into the realm of mixture of movement, of locomotion. Certainly a kind of, let's say, a kind of Eurocentric Western understanding of architecture likes to believe that architecture should be fixed, stationary, permanent. in both a cultural, material, structural sense. We study statics in school. It's not a good thing usually if the floors are moving in your building. That's usually a sign of some kind of structural failure. But I think we try to kind of point to examples and argue in this book that that's a kind of very limited, certainly a kind of Western Eurocentric, but also just a limited sense of the kind of pleasures and possibilities that are available in building if we start to untrain this idea that buildings are fixed and stationary. Because even a structurally sound building is anything but fixed and stationary. Buildings move in a variety of both kind of mundane and magical ways. Whether it's simply operating a window or a garage door, whether it's an automated kinetic facade or a retractable roof on a stadium, a glass elevator, a revolving rooftop restaurant. Building components that kind of feature moving parts have been part of architecture for many centuries. And so to think about how we can actually embrace the kind of locomotive qualities of buildings in the same way that we think about locomotion as a defining feature of creatures becomes a kind of central feature of the second essay and chapter of our book. Sometimes buildings literally do walk around. This was a kind of little news feed that hit our radar as we were writing the book of a building in Shanghai that was outfitted with hundreds of robotic legs and wheels to move it in order to prevent it from being demolished, a historic building, to make way for a new skyscraper. And there's certainly also speculative examples in the history of architecture where the idea of a building or even a city moving is something that we've seen before and that we can start to embrace in new ways. And for us, while the kind of literal locomotion of building is one thing, and again, something that we definitely don't want to discount, we're also interested in the sort of conceptual or cognitive ways that architecture animates or can be animated. The ways that even if the building is not literally moving on legs, the ways that we perceive buildings as having locomotive or animated qualities is equally important. And certainly, along these lines, the ways that we start to circulate around buildings or to give the impression of movement or the sense that they might get up and start walking around is another form of locomotion that we start to chart and look at. The way that when we approach qualities of the built environment from different directions, from different angles, that different figures and sensibilities might snap into and out of optical perception. Oops, skipped ahead there. So the second part of the book kind of charts the different ways, both literal and fictional, programmatic and optical, that we can think about and embrace how buildings move around like a creature.
So, and I think in the idea of locomotion and movement, whether it's literal or perceived, there is this idea of the building having life, being alive in a certain way in terms of its kind of vibrancy, its animation, and it is a kind of form of animism, or an alternative understanding of animism, or an extension of animism of really allowing there to be this kind of this other kind of meaning and relatability to the objects that we live among. So the next category, the next topic that we're going to talk about is this idea of architectural companionship. This is a guide to architectural companionship, and in the third essay of the book, we ask the question: how do architectural creatures love? So we're really talking about, the idea that we do exist in relationship to the buildings that we live, work, play, go to school in. But maybe there's a potential to expand the way that we think about those relationships, to amplify the role that they play in our lives, to make them more intimate, and to understand more dynamically the ways that these buildings engage in our social and emotional lives, kind of like the way that what you might call a pet or a domesticated animal becomes part of the family and really becomes a person in their own right in a family. Maybe your home does the same thing, and it does. And there are ways to think about architecture, as having that kind of psychodynamic reciprocal relationship. So one of the ways that we're talking about love, is sort of this conventionally romantic love or rather intimacy that suggests this kind of love. So part of the, and we're familiar with John Haydick's drawings that talk about architecture and love, so that in this case it's not even human beings that are involved in the intimacy, it's just two buildings on their own having this relationship. But we break down this idea of love by looking at like the idea of the 5 love languages, and we translate those love languages, which Joseph, you might need to help me remember all of them, but gift giving, physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service. In our case, we have these categories that run along the axes of synchronous and asynchronous, extroversion and introversion, and we talk about interior intimacy, interspecies communication, exterior generosity, and performance architecture. In all of these categories, I think the other direction that we were trying to head with this idea of intimacy is not just romantic love, intimacy in the form of romantic love, but intimacy as a form of attunement and solidarity, the kind of familiarity that we can have with other beings in our environment, and the recognition that there is this kind of interdependence and the sort of matrix that we exist within that's so much bigger than just a single architectural object, but this kind of larger network of relationships. So this is one of the projects that we talk about within that matrix, that's talking about public space on a much larger urban scale, and a kind of network of public spaces across many city blocks, and the ways that those spaces interact with each other, both in open space and in formal volumetric configurations. And so here we're getting back to this idea of creaturely architectures as opposed to the architectural creatures that we talked about before, where these creaturely architectures have an enhanced capacity for companionship because they operate from a position of solidarity with other creaturely beings in the world, human, non-human, abiotic, and by offering strategies to feel in common with the built environment and its various inhabitants. One version of solidarity can be achieved through the granting of personhood to non-human and abiotic entities. So for instance, this manatee astronaut in Fred Sharman's non-human autonomous space agency, where it's not human astronauts going into space, but manatees and chickens being launched into satellite around Earth. Or simply the idea that human beings can sort of take on architectural form themselves, and in relationship to one another create these kind of situations that bring the public into engagement with this kind of lively architectural configuration. And then of course there are examples from contemporary architecture that we saw last night in Chris Cornelius's work with his practice of Studio Indigenous and the moon domiciles, and he talks very explicitly about the idea of using these structures as a kind of character building and storytelling. I have a quote, we reference his quote, the architectural elements that I play with are the legs, where the dwelling meets the sky, the way in, the ground it sits on, the modulation of light via cantilevers. Each of these present a representational opportunity. I would like the viewer to see them and wonder if it smells or sweats or ambulates. These forms show up as protective carapace, supportive structures, water collection wings, support columns, canopy, headdress, and projective subtraction. So, you know, he's seeing these as companions in relationship to bear or deer or wolf, and in relationship to the many aspects of the site itself, and sort of telling their story from multiple perspectives.
So I think we're going to invite Trudy back up in a second. But I think this kind of brings us to the space that we're in now. And I think ultimately this idea about companionship is really interested in how we can start to expand our own human capacities for empathy. The idea here is not that, like, this is not a kind of social engineering exercise that architecture is going to kind of solve problems of violence or on a much smaller scale, just the kind of aloofness or other kinds of, let's say, lack of human emotion with each other. That's not at all the ambition. But the ambition is if we do find ourselves in environments that are more attuned to both the intimacies of itself as a built environment and also attuned to the intimacies of our body, perhaps it might be a kind of small step in helping expand our own capacity for imagination and our own capacities for empathy. That we might start to live in an environment where other kinds of solidarity and relationship are possible. And you know, one of our favorite things, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the installation, but my favorite parts of this installation are just kind of discovering the little moments, even the introverted moments, where community members and students who use this building, start to huddle up with architecture, start to carve out little spaces within the broad openness of this building, and to have a kind of more specific or intimate encounter. I think on a kind of practical level, this installation was really interested in thinking about more broadly about how to activate pockets of personable programming throughout the public spaces of this building. And certainly as a kind of epicenter of that, thinking about the existing bleacher steps as already a kind of site of specificity with the human body, but through the kind of definition of a gateway, of a backdrop, of a kind of temporary and sometimes roving enclosure, we can start to define more kinds of specificity and maybe even playfulness about how we start to interact with our built environment, whether that's literally moving around some of the walls, or whether that's leaning up against a strange pink juicy object. So I think from this point on, there's more we want to kind of say and elaborate on that, but I want to invite Trudy up, and we'll have a little bit more conversation, and we're also going to open things up. Audie.
Good to be back. Thank you for your book, for your work in this really lovely lightning talk that gives us kind of a roadmap, and I hope all of you a roadmap and sort of piques your interest in terms of diving deeper into the book itself. I'd love to stick kind of where we're at with the installation and what you said about the possibilities that an empathetic design mindset, which may open up out of this sort of regard for the built environment as creaturely, sort of what are the possibilities of that for you as designers in practice? And if you could maybe in contrast to other design efforts, like what is the difference for you as a designer when you attempt to design in a creaturely way and when you're not designing in a creaturely way? So like what's the impact of practicing creatureliness in terms of your own empathy or what you think is possible or what's happening in the installation? Sorry, I'm packaging 16 questions into one. But my question is, what's the difference between practicing design in a creaturely way and practicing it perhaps in another way or a traditional way?
I think in some way it's a matter of it's a matter of awareness, maybe, and a difference in degrees rather than in kind. Like, I don't think we're reinventing how to design, or necessarily even saying that we, like, that people, this is something that people don't already do, but I think it's just drawing more deliberate attention to what it feels like to have this kind of awareness. Because feelings are not something that we talk a lot about in architecture and design, in my experience in architecture. And I think that the process of design is one that makes people feel a lot of different things. And so I think, and it's, you know, and it's full of joy, and it's full of fear, and it's, and it goes through a lot of different cycles and processes when you're in process, and then similarly when you're like encountering the outcomes of it. And so I think it's a combination of like what I want as a designer interacting with a client, what I want that relationship to be like, and then I also think it's like what I want a broader public to be aware of when they're living in the world, and therefore like impacting what they demand of their spaces, you know? So there's sort of from both ends a difference, I think, that I desire.
And I would just briefly add to that, I also think it has to do with finding cues and clues to remind us that everything in architecture is part of an imagination, and therefore subject to be rewritten, subject to be adjusted and re-scripted. I think one of the things that architecture sometimes has trouble with or one of the things we have trouble with architecture, both, is that because it's all around us all the time, and we often take its sort of reality and its facts for granted. This is something that I think, for me, as a kind of practicing architectural designer, I often really turn to our kind of friends in the other arts, who I think sometimes have an advantage of having more of a specific kind of narrative frame around a piece of artwork, whether that's literally the frame of a kind of painting, or whether it's the proscenium of a stage, or whether it's the kind of, whether it's the gallery itself that sort of separates an artwork from what we perceive as reality. I think there's something about creatureliness and the creative act that is endowed in all creatures that reminds us that we can actually punch, in our case, sometimes a cartoon-shaped hole into the fabric of reality to suggest that other ways of being and relating are possible. So I think it's not about what it looks like, and it's not that it's like a right way to design, but it's like a way of being really emphatic and sometimes even exaggerating that this is a synthetic environment that's part of an imagination and a creative process, and not something that was inevitable, and not something that we just sort of take for granted, or that is merely here to serve our needs, which sometimes we, I think, assume a little bit.
Thank you. As you're talking about this, and I'm curious to kind of start to bring folks into the conversation, there's the space of possibility that you create. So there, where you're sort of acknowledging that a creaturely architecture perhaps undermines the norms, formal norms that we might expect. Like, maybe I don't expect a cartoon hole in a building. Maybe I don't expect to encounter feelings. Like, as you were speaking about that, Julie, I was thinking about like literally the embodied feeling of laughter that I had when I just saw that picture of the Sears Tower with a face. I mean, that's hilarious. It's going, so that's also something everyone should Google, is when architecture is funny. But those are two things that maybe we get locked into ways of being in practices around design in the built environment. So there's a playfulness, and there's maybe something from childhood that we can see the animate in the inanimate. So like, for everyone in the crowd, like, how many people as kids saw at least a stuffed animal as literally alive? Come on, university people. Yeah, a few people. or a rock, or your favorite place, or an easier one, your dog is having, or cat, or rabbit, or hamster is having, you know, a human personality, or a big enough personality to see it as human. So it feels like your work really opens up that space of possibility too, which perhaps many of us had as kids. And whether you're an architect or a graphic designer, you know, we're trained in these fields that, you know, they're aesthetic, they're delightful, they're full of passion, but maybe have a tendency to sort of drain that playfulness out of us. So, and I'm curious about that too. So like, again, like sticking with practice, what is it like for you to sort of approach this work, either as authors of the book, designers of a space like this, as you continue to evolve creatureliness, or sort of where is it heading next? Where do you feel the next sort of fertile playground is in this space?
It's a little hard for me to answer it right off the bat because I'm a little bit in some transition in terms of what I'm working on and how I'm working. But I think that that's actually also part of the answer to the question is like that there's a certain kind of like fluidity and allowance of like making changes and adjustments in terms of like my relationship to design. That's an important part of this process. Like I totally relate to everything Joseph said about the sort of formal qualities and the need to recognize the artifice and the potential for play within that, and the potential for expressing desire and the potential for laughter, and those are all things that I've valued in what I do. But more recently, my practice has been much less focused on like designing form and much more about my engagement with my community. So Trudy mentioned that I play a big role as a kind of community advocate in my community, and I'm working with a group of my neighbors to kind of push back against a proposed development on a lake that's right in our village. And it's this very beloved community resource, public space, and it's surprising, it took me by surprise to find myself as an architect who builds things to be in this position. But I recognized that after writing this book that was about this sort of broader network of relationships in your immediate environment and your awareness of those relationships, that like I had this relationship to a lake and that I had to all of a sudden speak on its behalf, and I felt compelled to do that. And so that for me is part of my next step from this book, which was a surprise, and I kind of had to kind of give myself the space to feel that and to feel into what the connection is between designing cartoon-like creaturely architectures and writing this book and then becoming a kind of environmental advocate.
Yeah, and just to capitulate that thought, I think maybe it's obvious, but it's no accident that, you know, we call lakes bodies of water. Like we already kind of use analogies to creaturely forms within the kind of existing language of geography and geology as well. And you know, Lake Erie was granted personhood status by the people of Toledo, Ohio a few years ago in an effort to try to give it legal rights to protect it against industrial contamination. So these things aren't in any way operating in a vacuum, and while Lake Erie and, is it Lake Philmont? Summit Lake. While those lakes don't look anything like this installation, I think we're trying to start, through our book, we're trying to start to think about those things alongside each other and think about how these things are all related as part of a broader effort of like broadening a definition of personhood. But I think to get back to your question, I think for me, like channeling childhood like remains a really central part of my practice and research. And I think it was maybe Timothy Morton who said something like, you know, if all like world leaders actually like brought their stuffed animals with them to, you know, to political convenings, like our world might look different. if somehow it was still okay to bring your stuffed animals to work with you as an adult, maybe we would have a slightly different world, which I'm very sympathetic to. And I think your question was like, what work do we have to do next? I think for me, and I have not figured this out yet, but I think for me, what the work is for me next is like how to better convince grown-ups and adults that sort of channeling childhood in explicit ways, in architectural ways, in formal ways, in programmatic ways, into not necessarily specifically like things that are programmed for children, is not only okay, but is desirable and